And welcome back. Nick Brophy, how are you, sir?
I'm wonderful. Thank you, Michael.
Welcome to the Waves Open Sessions. Now, for everybody who has just tuned in, Nick Brophy is a producer, mix engineer, recording engineer based out of Nashville, Tennessee. He is live with us here, and we are going to be going through Waves Open Session. Nick, tell us a bit about first of all, tell us a bit about you. This is your stage. Tell us who you are, what you do,
Okay.
and let's go from there.
Okay. Well, first of all, I have to do a big old shout out and thanks to Waves for having me do this. You know, I've only recently become an artist on the Waves roster, and already they're plugging me into these incredible opportunities to be heard and share some knowledge that I've accumulated over all these years. And I've been using Waves plugins since I guess it's the mid '90s. So I guess that makes me a Waves OG for sure. Um, and I really do use these plugins. I think I've used them in every session I've done in the last 25 years. So, but yeah, I started out in a band. So I'm a musician. I segued into engineering. I was the guy in the band that always liked doing the demos. So I got interested in that and became an engineer, an in-house engineer at Herb Alpert's Rondor Music Studios in Los Angeles. I was there for 5 years, and during that time, I was staying after hours working on my own songs and got signed as a writer to EMI, and then to a producer management company called World's End with Sandy Robertson. So I kind of made the leap from a player in a band to kind of like producer songwriter guy. I've worked with quite a few bands over all these years, from uh, Rolling Stones to Avril Lavigne to Hootie and the Blowfish, Big and Rich. I've written songs for Jason Aldean, Kenny Chesney, Rascal Flatts. I do a lot of film and TV stuff. I just do as much as I can.
Have you
So,
always been in Nashville?
no, I moved to Nashville from Los Angeles in 2003.
Oh yeah. So
So,
yeah, it's like um, I think one of the things I love about Nashville is how friendly everybody is there.
yeah, for
Um,
sure. And
it's
efficient.
very, very, very efficient. It's for one of the things we were talking about in the pre-show chat was the fact that correct me if I'm wrong, but this session, what we're looking at, was all tracked at exactly the same time. Am I right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is what's called a Nashville tracking session, which John Rich likes producing in that. Uh, I guess that venue is having Sony ATV studios where we did it, and it's a big glass open room so you could see everybody, and he can communicate really well with the musicians, and these guys are all top notch. In fact, I should give a shout out to some of the players on this track.
You should.
um, Greg Morrow on drums, loops and percussion, and Jimmy Lee Sloas on bass. Danny Rader, who I think plays with Keith Urban live, he's on acoustic, mandolin, and banjo. Adam Schoenfeld is on electric, as well as Troy Lancaster. They're both on electric. Steel is Mike Johnson, and piano is Mike Rojas. And these guys are amazing players. And it's so cool. If you've ever had the pleasure and luxury of a Nashville tracking session, I'd never seen anything like it coming from LA. In LA, you're right at your computer, and you're so intense. You're thinking you have so much responsibility and so much to do. And when you get in a session like these guys do, literally all you have to do is sit back and hit record. And these guys listen down to the demo or the rough one, maybe two times, make little notes on their chart, and go out and deliver performance within a take or two, complete with signature licks and hooks and everything. It's amazing.
Yeah, it really is. It's like I've seen a few Nashville sessions in my time, and efficient is probably the understatement of the year. So,
Yes, yes.
all right,
It's such. Go ahead.
so let's have a listen. Can we have a listen to this?
Yeah.
Let's listen to kind of like a verse and a chorus, so people know what we're playing with.
Okay.
Baby, when I look at you with them baby blues cutting right through me, you set me on the rewind back to the good times when you couldn't get enough of me. I guess I'm giving myself away, saying all the things I never did say. I lose myself, there's nothing else I can do. Baby, when I look at you, hey baby, when I look at you, last thing I thought I'd see was you across the bar from me and holding on to that turkey bottle,
cool.
shooting them down and running full throttle.
So there you go. A little bit of the song.
That's a really cool song. I've heard that song many times. So
Yeah.
I always think it's cool to get a look behind the curtain and see exactly what's going on.
Yeah, yeah, this is a big song for them, and it was a really fun session to be a part of. I was fortunate to get to engineer it as well. That makes mixing sometimes easier. So, I think first of all, I want to talk about prepping and organization. That's on my notes here, and that's just when you're not the engineer necessarily. I mean, you would not believe the number of sessions that I receive to mix that are so disorganized, and there's regions everywhere. There's percussion tracks intermixed with the keyboard section. There's a background vocals between the snare and the tom tracks, and you have to find all that stuff, and it can just slow everything down. So I'm sure you guys have heard of, to do this, but just to color code everything in kind of groups, and that's kind of the way I start, is just kind of moving everything into the place that it needs to be. And so I have in my dark blue is all the drums, the live drums, and then loops and percussion is in the light blue. This kind of brick red is bass, and then the gold color is acoustic, and then you have this the other kind of acoustic instruments, a banjo and mando in this case, and the green instruments are the electrics. And by the way, I think it's important to kind of pare down. I also get sessions where you have all the mics on. So you got the SM57, you have the R, the 121 and 421, and it's all just the same performance, but you got all these tracks to contend with. So you may have 15 tracks, but you have 5 guitar, really 5 guitar tracks. So I try to pare all that down. If you have similar kind of tonal or balance, then I put them on stereo tracks, and that makes EQing and compressing so much easier. And then you have less to look at as well. And I think that kind of stems from the early days of Pro Tools, when resources were important to kind of hold back and maintain. You can't just kind of throw everything on there. Nowadays you can, but my kind of practices kind of stem from the early days. I remember at the studio where I was head engineer, we had this Quadra 800. It was like the cream of the crop at the time, and we'd literally process something and come back the next day to see how it sounds. It was like that. So when you come from that, you kind of like keep it to a minimum, and that's kind of what I did in this session, is just consolidate down. So
before we go any further, because we were just talking about tracking, Nathan Corlew has a question which I thought I'd get in now, but so he doesn't get missed. Yeah. How much of the Nashville tracking method is done today differently compared to 20 years ago? He worked in Nashville in the 80s. How is it different now, do you think? I mean, you've been there for nearly 20 years.
Right. Well, there was a time where it was the heyday of the Nashville way, which is booked sessions. In fact, they cut demo sessions with the same players, you know, so you get these killer demos. But you know, times have changed and budgets have shrunk, and so people have taken to their home studios, and you do, you know, more drum programming, and maybe one guy, the producer, is playing more instruments. So I think that's kind of how it's changed in a way, but they still do these tracking dates, and these players are still in demand.
So you were saying, I think in the pre-show, it's like you've got like a 10 a.m., a 2, a 5, and a 9.
Yeah, it's a 10, a 2, and a 6 is basically what it is. Yeah, and it's so efficiently done. It's like these guys, they're showing up, and the downbeat is supposed to be 10 o'clock, and it is. And that goes from 10 till 1 o'clock, and then they have a lunch break for an hour. And then you resume right at 2. Everybody's right back at their instruments ready to go. And then you go from 2 to 5, and then you have a dinner break. And then you go from 6 till 9. And within those 3-hour blocks, you have, I mean, you can accomplish as much as, you know, from 3 to, if you push it, sometimes 5 songs, and you're getting all the basics, basic tracks. You get overdubs and everything. It's amazing what you can get done in one day.
Yeah, it really is. Nashville's one special place for that. Okay, cool. So let's take a listen to the session. Where do you want to start? It looks like you're on the drums.
Yes, I want to start with drums because a lot of people ask, like, how do you start mixing a song? And assuming you don't have a rough mix going, or that you're sent a session that's already kind of mixed, you want to know how to build it up. And to me, it's sort of like building a foundation to put stuff on. And the best foundation in most pop or country or rock music is the drums, because it's sort of like the lowest low end and the highest high end. And if you can get a good balance of that, then you already have parameters to work within. So I'd like to start with a kick. You know, let's just solo up a kick, and I'll show you basically what we were looking at of the tracked kick. So it's kind of mid-rangey, flappy. And so I've got my studio rack chain that I put together, and this one is the Kick SSL. And what I'm doing is just adding some of that crispy top, and then a lot of the low bottom. It's around 50 hertz, and then some of the SSL compressor, and then a little bit of saturation from the Abbey Road, which I love. That gives it just a little bit of console saturation. So this is before, and that's after. So it hollows out kind of those mid-rangey frequencies, opens up the bottom end, and then let's see, I have that's the inside kick, here's the outside kick, and the sub kick. So I kind of get a balance of that. And I don't try on these kind of sessions where you have such great players with such great instruments. I don't like to rely solely on a sample. That's where you can kind of get kind of away from the natural sound of the drums. And to be honest, I get a lot of sessions where a lot of the live drums are just, all the phasers are turned down, and they're just featuring a big old kick sample and a snare sample and some fake toms, and maybe some cymbal overdubs even. And I'm thinking, well, where was the real drums, you know?
Right.
So I think it's a good practice to dive into a drum kit and see what you can get out of it. So this particular drum sample that I'm using, as you could see, it's just kind of for support.
What we're seeing right now is the mix window. Is that what was supposed to be looking at? I'm seeing the mix. I'm seeing the mix window and studio rack.
Yeah, and I'm kind of circling the kick is on the far. It's highlighted right now. The kick sample.
You might want to scroll your screen then, because I can't see it.
Okay. Is this better?
That's there. Yeah, now I see it.
Okay. So on the far left, I have the kick sample, and this is actually a sample I took from the session. So it's the same guy.
Bit more left, actually. All right, now you're on the edge of the screen again. Beautiful.
Okay, great. And so it's just supporting the kick right now. It's not relying on the sample. It's just supporting a little bit. And so I'll solo. Let me show you solo before the Studio Rack plugin and after. So here's kick before, and there's after. Big difference. And obviously it's just opening up that kick sound. And then I'm going to tuck in the kick sample. And then we'll move over to the snare. So that's the tracked sample. I'll go back to this verse. Okay, and then here's with my Studio Rack chain, which is the SSL snare. Adding that same compression from the SSL compressor, a little bit of low end and some top end, and that's after. And this is the under snare mic. And then a little bit of help from, again, Greg's own snare sample. So then I start bringing in the overheads, and the trick I use is to tuck it in when it's in mono. Because if you have the kick and snare going and you start bringing in the overheads, you'll start seeing that those kick and snare start to put in a space, like the environment. You start to feel that. And that's a good way to judge it, because I think if you're bringing it up when it's in stereo, since you've been listening in mono to the kick and snare up the middle, then all of a sudden you might not bring it up enough. So right. I put it in mono, and then you start to really sense, okay, that's feeling good. Then you can open up in stereo. And here we'll add a little bit of room. That's the stereo room, mono room, a little bit of hi-hat. Okay, so they're starting to sound pretty good there.
So Tim Feswick has asked, how do you get that huge kick and snare sound in modern country? I think you're answering that one right now.
Yes, with the Studio Rack, I mean, these Waves plugins will do it.
So let's talk about Studio Rack for a second,
yeah.
because there might be some people who don't actually know what Studio Rack is. So
yeah,
any of you out there in Waves land, if you have any Waves bundle, then you can go into your Waves account and download and register a copy of Studio Rack for free. And it works in pretty much any ASIO and Core Audio compatible DAW or DAW. So,
right.
So this is a plugin, and one of the things that you get in this plugin is a lot of Nick's presets. This is a plugin that literally lets you add 8 plugins and create your own chain. So this is a really, really, really fun plugin to have in your tool rack and arsenal.
Oh, it's so powerful, because it's sort of like, you know, if you're setting up a kick chain, you're going to be stacking plugins, and this way you can consolidate it, kind of have your go-to settings, your go-to EQs. By the way, in my Studio Rack chains, I only use the good EQ, so just keep that in mind. And so yeah, I mean, it's just so much easier to dial in a quick sound. You got, you know, for mine, I put in 2 bands of low end and 2 bands of high end. So there's kind of like an A/B switch. This would be your lower high frequency, which in this case is like 5K bell, and then the B, which is higher up, which is 8K shelf. So both those for the high end and the low end. And then I have 2 choices of SSL compression. One is kind of like the SSL channel compression, and then B, which we're using on this, is the SSL compressor plugin.
And to be clear, the area that that Nick is talking about right now, these macros, you can actually assign any parameter or a combination of parameters to these macros so they can actually control multiple things, going on at the same time, which is ridiculously cool.
Oh, it's so convenient, yes. And there's
Yeah.
things that you just can't do. I have on my vocal a chain that I put together this radio effect, and it's basically anything between the normal vocal sound all the way to radio, like all the way radio. So it's anything in between, and to get the in between by fiddling with a ton of knobs to do it and compressor is just like it's impossible to do. So it makes things super convenient.
One of the things that I love about your presets is that you've given people a full palette of effects and colors to work with that they can choose to turn on or off,
Yeah,
as they please.
I couldn't help myself. It's exactly like, oh my gosh, I could put together my dream, chain, and so I just threw it all on there. But I find that if you just try it out and see what you think, I think you'll see that it has pretty much anything to dial in a quick sound.
So I have a question here from
Yeah.
Jared. Jared wants to know, when you start the drum mix, do you start with the kick, snare, hat, toms, old school, or start with overheads and room to get a good sound and then use individual tracks to enhance the kit?
Right. Well, I usually start with the kick and snare, and it's good to train yourself to kind of know a good kick and snare sound and kind of carve that out. And then I start bringing in the overheads. And like I was showing you, if you do it in mono, it can set those direct kick and snare mics into a space. And once you feel like you're starting to put it in the space, then I think you have a good balance. And I'm going to show you another trick pretty soon here. Right now, I'm going to show you how to add reverb to your drums. So right now, we're just hearing, that's what was tracked that day. But if you put, a lot of people ask, like, do you put reverb on the snare and the toms? And I say no. I say put it on the overheads, room, mono room, hi-hat, anything that is an overhead, because what you're going to do is you're going to just create more, you're going to extend that space. So listen to this. Listen how cool this starts to sound. I'll just open up these drum verb sends. That's before. So it sounds completely natural. You're getting plenty of that, the extension on the snare. You'll even hear it on the toms. If we go to a tom section, you'll hear. So I have no verb on the toms, yet they sound like they're verbed. So right. That's a really good trick to try. And then the next thing I do is, once I find like I get a good balance on the drums, I solo them up. Like, I should probably mention that I'm using parallel drum compression as well on this. And that is simply the CLA 76, the Bluey. It has more aggression to me. So I'm just tucking that in a little bit to the drums and sending that all into my drum bus, which, by the way, I discovered this recently. This 160 is amazing for that.
It's an amazing plugin. I have a question here from Mark Siegel, who wants to know, how are you EQing the overheads? Are they full spectrum or just for cymbals?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that's why I think this reverb method works well, because I do full spectrum on the overheads, because I want to hear the drums take on that space. A lot of people carve off all the low end, or they might filter it down from 150, 200 down, and just take all that out. And so that you end up with just cymbals. And there's no right or wrong, but for me, I'm trying to get a natural sounding drum kit. So I use full spectrum on that. And then as you add the verb to that, it sounds thick. It sounds like the whole kit is getting verbed.
Right.
So after that, this is a great trick to try. If you don't have a subwoofer, I use a subwoofer. A lot of you guys don't have that. But I will use this right here is your mix assistant, because there are days when your ears can deceive you. When I was first doing mixing, I would find that some days I'd nail it and other days I don't. And I was like, what the heck, you know? And it's just because if you trust your ears exclusively, then you'll have good days and bad days. But if you can get some help visually on what you're doing, that can really help you be consistent. So what I do is I solo up all the drums like they are and run that through the PAZ analyzer on RMS. So I'm going to take the average frequency range from everything. And I've already done that curve so we can see it here. Let's see, I have to go find it. Sorry about that.
You're fine.
Documents, Pro Tools, plugin settings, waves, and then I put it in my studio rack, PAZ. Okay, so drums and loop. So you capture the curve, and that's what the drums looks like. So then you just kind of graph that to the memory and put it in the background. And then we'll move on to bass. So now we're going to solo up the bass and listen to that. And for this, I just kind of added, once again, our friend. And I've added some mid-range and a little bit of low end. Because this guy has a great tone anyways. Not much to do on that one. And then just a little bit of compression to contain it. That's the clean one, clean version. Bluey's a little more aggressive and Blackie is cleaner. So I just went for that. And then here's another thing I do is I use a little bit of widener on the bass. And I'll show you the difference. If I go to the waveform analyzer and play the bass, look down here, it's just straight up the middle, nothing left and right going on at all. And so what I use is put a little bit of this on, it spreads the bass out so it's not just in the center. And all that is the CLA plugin with Mr. Wide all the way up. That's all you got to do. I put that on a effect return.
Sounds amazing.
Yeah. So that just is a little bit of width there. So once you dial in your bass sound, then what you want to do is solo that, play through the song, and capture that curve, which I've done already as well. And it looks like that. So what you'll notice is that your low end is very evenly matched. So that helps you not to just rely on your ears, but now you have visual confirmation that your low end is matched, and you can then treat it as one thing, your low end of your kick and drums and your bass. So you know that that's pretty dialed in now. So you can solo up your drums and bass. So believe it or not, the next thing I do is vocals.
Before we hit vocals,
yeah.
Before we hit vocals, a couple of people want to take a bit of a closer look at the studio rack on the drums, because we had the macros open and we weren't actually showing the plugin. So can we go back? Can we go back to let's go back to the kick or another drum and just take a quick bit of a dive into what it looks like in there and what you're doing with those plugins rather than the macros. Let's have a look at the rack.
Okay, you got it. So the first thing I have in here is the SSL channel, and this is kind of like my kick curve that I start with all the time, and it's what I've found over the years that kind of like it just improves any kind of kick sound to a degree. And so I start with that, And that's preset, and there's no macro attached to that. Then I have my adjustment EQs, which I explained to you before on this. Let's see, we'll go to all. I have my high frequency first. So we'll look at those. That's the first chain up here. And if I go to B, then this lights up, and I have this option. And let's see, that's 900. So let me move this out of the way. There we go. So see, I'm just kind of dialing in some high end there. And this one is set at the 5K bell. And that one is this one over here. And that is 8K shelf. So that's kind of what I'm doing with that. And then I go into the low end over here. Let me put this one back.
Don't forget that the bottom half of the E channel is currently behind your face.
Ah, okay. Move this over. Is that better?
Much better, thank you.
Okay. And so then I just go to the next parallel split, which is the low end options. And I have the first SSL channel, which is dialing in the low end, which is the lower of the low end, which is 50 bell. And then if you go to the other option B, that is this guy. And he is up here at 100 bell. So those are kind of your EQ options there.
So this is a plugin preset that's actually in Studio Rack that you created that anybody can access. Am I right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Which one is this one, just so that people know?
This one is the Kick SSL.
Okay, so it's under the Nick Brophy. If you can show from the settings, so if you go load,
Yep.
Under artists and then your name right there. So it's under...
It's this one right here.
Right, beautiful. Okay, so there you go, folks. That's where you can access these.
And then there's a knee version of both, too. So I have all the different elements of the drum kit, both SSL and knee versions. And then I have my own little presets. So...
Okay, let's dig into the names a bit. I'm curious about the names. I'm sure some other people are too.
Yeah, there's no rhyme or reason for it. It's actually, I was thinking, how do you explain a name? Some people get so funny with that because they'll be like, I don't know, To the Moon Kick or something like that. And I just thought, let's just name them last names because you can memorize. Yeah, you can memorize that just as easily. And it's like, I just pictured people going, man, I love the Estrada kick. That's awesome, you know? Or I love the Sanchez vocal. And, you know, it's just fun.
I'd be a lot more Monty Python about it. I'd probably like, this is Bob.
Right.
Okay, so moving on. So we have another question here. When, where is it? Here we go. Ken Holt wants to know, what about space and air in your tracks? Is there a tendency in contemporary country for air, in quotations, or are there more pads and more of a wall of a sound approach these days?
Yeah, well, I like maintaining some air, and it all depends on the song itself, right? It's like if there's more openness in the song and more space in the song, then you're going to perceive all that air that you're looking for. And I personally like maybe what you're kind of indicating is more like a pop sound, you know, which is, it's going to have more low end and more high end, more of that air. I shoot for that myself. But sometimes the combination of instrumentation just gets more in that mid-rangey, like the low mids kind of build up. And it's just a battle of like, how do you treat the song? You know, what's the song asking for?
There's a backup question for that from Wolfgang, who wants to know, what are the biggest differences and approaches between mixing a modern country song and a standard pop song these days, which is pretty much connected to the last question, really.
Yeah. Well, I think we've talked the other day, actually, Michael, about how the lines have gotten blurred between pop and country, and that's true more now than when this song was done. But I think the one thing that that you want in country music, you're going to contend with live instruments, a lot more live instruments. It's not just all programmed these days. There's more of that, but you're still going to have live players. So you need to know how to mix and EQ acoustics and mandolins and dobros and all that stuff. And then as far as vocal goes, in pop, vocal kind of uh, it kind of like emphasizes the emotion and the feeling of the song. Whereas in country, it's the emotion and the meaning of the song. So it's not to say that that just means the vocal needs to be louder. It just like never lose that in your mind that the meaning of these lyrics needs to come across. In pop, it's like, I don't know what they said, but it feels good, you know? So it doesn't matter quite as much. Those are the two things that I would think that country is requiring.
Yeah, it's like, I mean, I think it's like there's always, the lyrics have always got a story to them, don't they?
Yeah, often they do.
Yeah.
More so than in pop, I'd say.
Oh,
So,
big time. Yeah, absolutely.
yeah.
Okay, so talking about vocals,
Yeah,
let's
I'm gonna
move to the
go.
vocals.
Yeah, I'm gonna solo up John. You'll hear the leakage on this one because this is what he did in the booth that day. So,
Thing I thought I'd see was you across the bar from me and holding onto that turkey bottle, shooting them down and running full throttle.
so
Oh,
I've added my NB vocal studio rack chain to this, which I'm adding some air on his vocal up there. That's again the 8K. Oh, that's the 10K.
Can we go to the all tab so we can see the
Yes.
plugins as well?
Yep,
Beautiful,
yep.
thank you.
Yeah, and this one, I just love this plugin. This is so good. And this is what I'm using for the air. This is a 10K on this thing. And the low frequency is the, can you still see that okay?
You're going to move it left a bit, please, mate. Left.
Oh, my left.
Yeah, not the Australian left. Your left.
And then the low frequency, in this case, it's just straight up the middle. But you can see that it kind of moves both the lows and the low mids.
Right.
I've chained them together because I find that there's a bump otherwise in that range. So yeah, on this one, I'm just adding the air to them, and then I'm squashing them with the compressor, which first goes to the de-esser.
The original de-esser.
The original de-esser, which
Yeah.
is great, yeah. And then we're going into the CLA Bluey, and I have it pretty maxed out. And then as far as the radio sound goes, this one is straight up the middle. It's not adding any kind of overdrive, and it's not adding the radio sound, but I could show you what that does.
thing I thought I'd see was you across the bar from me and holding onto that
So what's
turkey.
cool about that is like, if you tried to do this, look at this, what this is doing. So when I go all the way to the radio sound, look how many knobs are turning, not to mention the compressor and the gate opening up. So try to do that where you're kind of like, I want just this much of it, you know?
Right.
I just want a hint of radio sound, which is
Thing I thought I'd see was
like in there.
you across the bar from me.
To try to dial that in quickly, good luck with that. So this is really handy for that.
Beautiful.
Yeah, and
Right.
so then the question is do you want to put the effects on the channel insert, or do you want to do them as sends and returns? And I always, because getting back to saving resources, computer resources, it's just more efficient to have them come up on this side. These are all my effects returns.
Right.
Than to just keep putting stuff on the vocal itself. And that's why you see that it's still a mono vocal and it's not turned stereo because there's no verb or anything on there. So let's listen now with a bit of effects on there, which I've used my same setting, which is the short vocal room that I have in my Studio Rack vocal chain plugin. I've used that as a return over here as well. So
Thing I thought I'd see was you across the bar from me and holding on
also
to
have a
that
tape slap, which is our amazing J37 plugin, which I love this thing.
thing I thought I'd see was.
And I actually timed that to 16th notes for the session, but kept it stereo with a 14 millisecond delay on the right side so that it becomes stereo. So I have that in, and then I have a long delay coming up on the chorus, which we'll hear.
Cutting right through me, you set me on the rewind back to the good times when you couldn't get enough of me. I guess I'm giving myself away.
So we'll put that in with what we have going so far.
Cutting right through me, you set me on the rewind back to the good times.
Now it sounds like a ton of delay, right? But as soon as you bring the other instruments, it eats that up really fast. So I'm gonna solo up Kenny now. And the cool thing about these guys is their vocal tone complements each other in the way that John, it tends to be dark and kind of, he's got some low mids in there and kind of a rounded on the top. And then Kenny has this sharp top end, but he has this super bottom. So I feel like they fit like this, you know, like Kenny fits on the up top of John and on the bottom as well. So it's a really good natural blend.
Cutting right through me, you set me on the rewind back to the good times when you couldn't get enough of me. I guess I'm giving myself away, saying all the things I never did say.
So, there you go. And then at that point, I start bringing in instruments because you have your foundation built. So now you can build the house of your mix. And so I'll bring in, you know, you can bring in electrics first. These acoustic instruments are quite featured on this song. So let's bring those guys in. Go back to the verse.
Last thing I thought I'd see was you across the bar from me and holding on to that turkey bottle, shooting them down and running full throttle. Oh, I can still taste the last time you and me and nothing but the tan lines keeps running through my mind, on and on and on and on. And baby, when I look at you with them baby blues.
Another thing to point out in this song, John had each guitar player play 2 full passes down of guitar parts. So it's like stacked full of guitars, this song. So we'll start bringing those guys in too. Let's see, I'm gonna go ahead and unmute everybody.
Last thing I thought I'd see was you across the bar from me and
Little piano. It's not the main featured type thing in this song. It's a texture, so he's kind of underneath. Just kind of brightened him up. And a little contained compression. So that's before. That's after. Okay, and then steel. Let's see where this guy's playing. So on this one, I have my bounce delay, which is 8th note dotted on the left and quarter note on the right. And it adds a nice kind of moving space to it. I like to set the steel kind of behind the track a little bit. Kind of pokes out every now and then. It adds a nice texture. And
cutting right through me. You set me on the rewind back to the good times when you couldn't get enough of me. I guess I'm giving myself.
So let's go to the solo for a second. Here's kind of an example. What I find in like when I mix prep stuff, I try to keep all my levels unity gain. And you can find that just by adding EQ, you can bump up the level of an instrument a lot. And so when you're flipping between the original and the kind of modified signal, it can be really deceiving because it's louder, but is it better sounding? So it's hard to tell unless it's a real fair exchange when you're A-Bing. So I'll show you like the solo with no effect on it. And I've added some EQ. So what you notice is that the level didn't change that much, but that's because I've adjusted for that in here. So I'm down 4.8 dB just to make it the same level as the original. So you can see that just by, if I were to just EQ that and leave it, it's going to hit my compressor harder than it should. And you can just get your unity gain all out of whack that way. And
the other thing I've noticed is you have the analog button off on that one. Do you tend to do a mix of analog on and off when you're using a lot of SSLs, or how do you approach that?
Yeah, I generally will pick and choose where I want the analog to be on, because it can build up if you're using a lot. As you can see, I use a lot of these SSL channels in the session, and when you start compressing, and then you got compression on that back end, and you're doing parallel compression, all of that that can build up. And so it's better to just go, which instrument do I really need that to be on, and put it on there.
No, that makes sense. So I've got a question here. I'm old. I've lost it now. Chris and Lana Green. That's two names. Chris and Lana Green. My wife sings. I don't expect a lot of emphasis on female country vocals with the Big and Rich song. So any recommendations for achieving a contemporary country female vocal in a mix would be great. Hold on though. There's also another question is any tips on an in-your-face vocal sound that doesn't sound over-compressed that you get in country? And then there's another one from George, who's asking how much compression is too much on vocals in this kind of country song. So before we spread on, we might want to go back and just take another look at those vocals and see if we can help a few people out.
Right. Well, for me, compression, it's hard to get too much unless it's starting to bring up too much sibilance and noise. But if you can contain that, it just adds energy. This song, as you'll notice, has so many instruments to compete with the vocal. It's important that it cuts through. And I prefer the sound of a compressed vocal for the energy that it brings, as opposed to just sitting there riding the vocal and making sure it's, peeking its head out of the track here and there. So for me, I like the heavy compression, can contain the sibilance. There's lots of tools for that. There's I'm using the original de-esser, but there's the whole, is it the sibilance plugin it's called? Or
sibilance.
Yeah, that thing is amazing. And that you can really fine tune and get in there and deal with that. And as far as like female and male vocals go, there's no rules to this. So whatever sounds good in the track, and that will really dictate how you treat a vocal. Every track's different. You wouldn't want to put so much compression on a track that's maybe a ballad with a ton of space, maybe not even drums and just acoustic and a piano or something. That you don't need that much compression for that. But these kind of rocking kind of pop songs, you can get away with it. Female vocals, you treat them the same to start out with. And then if there's harsh frequencies, then you can multi-band those out, maybe in the 2K range, 4K range. Just listen to it in the song is my advice to that. And there's always a tool to fix something. That's what I've that's what I know, and Waves has them.
There is. There is.
Yes.
Okay, so let's move on. So one of the things back to, because we were just playing all of the banjos, the mandolins, the electric guitars, the acoustics, etc. A couple of people have asked, and one of them is Ken. G'day, Ken. How do you deal with frequency collisions when you've got so many replays and takes of string instruments that use so many of the same frequencies?
Yeah. Well, there's something to be said. Like my friend Dave Sardi, who did like Jet and all those bands, he said there's something to be said about just rocking a mix. You know, like to overthink it or not to get too worried about stuff. Just use your ears and see if there's problems happening. Sometimes you can blend and just get a sound out of stuff, you know, like if you just use your judgment as to the levels and make sure that if it's not necessary that any one part of those instruments pokes out and gets recognized, it can just become a thing, you know, just make it a thing.
Right.
And then just, it will find its place in the track. And you would be surprised at how much energy that adds, because it's not like you're going, oh, there's that and there's that. It's just everything. And there's something to be said about that. And again, there's no right or wrong. I would just say use your judgment on that, and don't be afraid to let things just fly. You know, let it just do its thing.
So before we move on from this little area of the sessions, Cesar wants to know if you can comment on your general approach to mandolins and banjos, and if you address them or treat them any differently to, say, acoustic and electric guitars.
Yeah, that's a really good question, because acoustics and mandolins are kind of, they can get buried in a track with electrics for sure. And so first of all, you have to determine, in this case, especially like the acoustic, is just a texture. It's really nothing played on that that needs to be like distinguishable, but the mandolin and banjo do. So that's why the acoustic is up the middle and the banjo and the mandolin are on the left and right, so that they can kind of like, you know, sprinkle in here or there. And as far as tonally, you don't want to carve out the body of them, because then you won't feel their presence, but you do want to make sure that the top end is matched up with your high end of maybe your hat and your shakers, tambourines, that range. You want to have the acoustic instruments kind of dancing around with the other percussive instruments.
Cool. Beautiful. All right, Cesar, I hope that answered that question. So, okay, so we've talked about drums, we've talked about your vocals. How about we move on to the master and how you bring all of this together? Because this mix sounds phenomenal.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Yeah, well, what I kind of have a chain that I go to for my mix bus. And as you can see, I'm not just sending everything to the master, but I'm actually doing an aux and making that the mix bus. And then the mix bus then goes to the master. So the reason for that is because as you move the fader on a master, it affects what's sent into the inserts. So if you're fading out, for example, on the master track, it's going to lessen what's being sent to your mix or to your compressor that is up here, as opposed to if it's on an auxiliary, it's the same level that's hitting it, and then this reduction on the fader won't affect anything that you have going on up here. So that's one reason to do it. But I usually go into an EQ. On this song, I added a little bit of shimmer, or a little bit of 14K top end, and then I rolled off 20 hertz gradually. It's only a 6 dB octave on the high pass there, and then I go into the SSL compressor. So I love this thing. I put it on auto mode. A lot of people use it on the fastest release, which is great too. This song didn't really need that because it's not that much of a rocker. So I just left it on auto. And then I go into the Puig Tech, which is, this is sort of like, I do a similar thing to Chris Lord-Alge, which is I do a little bit of mastering EQ after the fact. And this is just kind of a curve that I like. I don't really fiddle with it that much. I kind of like just have it set. It's right here. Look, Nick Mix Bus. So it's kind of my go-to curve that I use. And after that, that's when I would send to a limiter. But for this demonstration, I didn't do any of that. But that's you can use the L1, the L3, the L2. You can use any of those things, and there's lots of great limiters to use to bring your mix up to CD level or to, you know, the commercial loudness level.
So talking about level, so how do you deal with artists or musicians or clients that you're working with who at the end of the day or when they're finished with the session want a mix and say it's not loud enough, but yet you know full well, and you have to sometimes say, I guess, it's like, this isn't mastered, so
Right.
this is, I mean, how do you deal with that? Because I'm sure there's a lot of people out there who are wondering the same thing.
Right. Yeah, and I hate to say it, but you will lose out every time, even to a rough mix that's louder. So I always send out my roughs with my own kind of mastering settings on there. And it's just kind of what you have to do to compete, because a lot of these people, they don't really know that it will sound better after a proper mastering job, but they've been listening to the rough, and so if they get your mix and it's just a lot quieter, like 4, 5, 6 dB quieter than what they've been listening to, then they will think the louder one sounds better. So it's good to kind of develop your own mastering method as well.
They're also, a lot of the time, they're kind of emotionally connected and bonded with the rough mix.
Yes.
That they've been living with sometimes for months as well.
Right.
So you're fighting that battle. Yeah, it's nearly
Right.
like, it's nearly like dealing with an ex-girlfriend or boyfriend. So
it so is, and that's a good point to bring up, because you truly have an advantage if there hasn't been a rough mix done. In this case, right, I tracked it so there wasn't anything but what I had done. So I didn't have to compete with anybody. But sometimes you will get roughs that are actually quite good. And that's sometimes you're playing beat the rough, and it's good to put it to where you can A/B between your mix and the rough, and that is simply just to find where did they put a delay trail, like where did they do a send that if you don't have it in your mix, they will miss it, so
and also it's like, what do they like so much about the rough that means that they're actually employing you in the first place if they loved it so much,
right?
So that's always a hard one, is like, okay, so let's play psychologist here. What is it that you like that you need changed?
Right. So true.
So I have a question here, quite a long one from Robert Waite. Wait, yes, it is Robert Waite. Sorry, Robert, I didn't want to get your name wrong. Do you usually make different mix versions after you've done the full mix? For example, just acoustics and vocals, instrument, a cappella? And if so, do you generally keep levels the same as those set during the full mix, or do you rebalance for each different version, or do you just make stems for any future versions?
Yeah, that's a good question, because it's depending on if you're doing a quote acoustic version of the song, or if you're just doing stems, breakouts. And most often, I just do an instrumental track and a TV track, and that's about it. these guys will come over to my house and close out the mix with me. So they don't need like a vocal up version or a vocal down version. That's pretty set. They're pretty happy at that point with what they have. So the only thing they might need in the future is a TV mix and maybe an instrumental. I tend to print an acapella as well, because that's helpful for maybe the song gets a sync placement or something. It's in a commercial and they need to take the vocal out in certain spots and then bring it back in. So that acapella is very helpful to have. But stems are required sometimes for live playing. They'll say, oh, we're going to use some, tracks from the recording live, because they don't want to take out every bit of, all these players. So I will do stems as well.
So when it comes to your mix, one of the things you mentioned right at the beginning was session organization.
Right.
Which is a big deal, and it's something I talk about a lot. I probably preach it way too much. When it comes to this, if you didn't record the session and you're mixing it, do you grab everything from the session and put it into this exact format straight away before you even start listening, or what's your method when it comes to that, so that you're working in your kitchen, nobody else's?
Right, that's a good question too, because I when I open up a session, and there's so many times, like I mentioned before, where I'll get sessions with regions everywhere, and the tracks are all haphazard. It's like they were just kind of working, and whatever they decided to work on next, they just went to the next track and stuff. And I won't know where to find anything. I'll take a quick listen to it, but ultimately, before I start working on it, I need to have it in where I can find everything. So I start kind of going through the names of the track. Oh, okay, well, that's a hi-hat, and well, here's the kick drum over here. And it's like, okay, got to find it all, put it to where I want it. And again, I have I don't know if I mentioned my checklist before I go to start mixing. Let's see if I can find it in my notes here. Oh yeah. Okay, are all the tracks consolidated down? And we talked about that before, where like you'll have guitar tracks with all kinds of mics, so you can consolidate that down. String parts, sometimes you will get live track strings where you got tons of violin tracks and violas and cellos, and you can kind of mix that down to a left and right. Do that ahead of time, so you're just contending with less later. And then I have are all samples flown and printed. So if you are going to use drum samples, rather than leave it in the sample app or plugin that you're using, what if 5 years from now you open the session and they haven't updated that app, or that plugin is no longer available? Then you won't have that kick sample or that snare sample anymore. So I always print those. And then let's see here, are all the vocals tuned and printed? For the same reason, you don't want to just leave the tuner on there, because number one, sometimes you'll find it might miss something when you're bouncing to the mix.
Right.
It's just better to have it printed that way, and you know it's going to be right. And then, are all your effects ready to go? Delay times and reverb times. So I have all that stuff, ready to go before I even start
stem out
bringing
your effects as well, just in case those, those pieces of technology aren't available as well? So do you kind of like ever, print your reverb onto a track so it's there as well as a separate feed to the actual vocal or the instrument it's on?
That's a really good method to do it. I personally don't do that, because I feel like all the mixed versions, including the stems that I print, are sufficient for probably most of the needs of the song in the future. They'll have it from how it sounded in the mix, they'll have it printed that way. Like if you did the vocal stems, they're going to be printed with the compression, the EQ, and the effects on them. Yeah. So, I think that's enough.
So let's just have a listen. So we've been through the drums, the vocals, the mandolins, the guitars, and the only thing we haven't really talked about was we didn't take a look at the piano. And I see you've got a V4 and a CLA compressor on there.
Yeah.
And was that piano mic'd and recorded?
Yes.
Okay, so beautiful. Now, would you use Studio Rack on something like this ever, or these are the only two plugins you usually use on your piano?
Oh gosh, again, there's no rules. It's just whatever makes it sound great. In fact, I when I was getting ready to do this, I saw Dave Auday's open session that he did, and he was raving about the Jack Joseph plugin. Yeah. And I'm like, oh, I got to try that sometime. I had already set this one, but there's all kinds of tools to try, and I say try them, see what's out there.
And that's another really good thing about presets too, isn't it? It's like, I mean, presets are literally one of the perfect starting places to get you where you need to be. So
absolutely, and there's so many of these amazingly talented people that have provided these presets. So I know how much effort I put into mine. Like I really wanted to do it not for just for everyone to enjoy, but for myself. It's like I want to use this too. So I poured a lot of effort into making sure it sounded great and was very easy to use.
Right.
So
no, we appreciate it. Can we just take just a quick listen to the mix again now that we've been through and we've dissected it a bit?
Yeah.
Baby, when I look at you with them baby blues cutting right through me, you set me on the rewind back to the good times when you couldn't get enough of me. I guess I'm giving myself away, saying all the things I never did say. I lose myself, there's nothing else I can do. Baby, when I look at you, hey baby, when I look at you, last thing I thought I'd see was you across the bar from me and holding on to that turkey bottle, shooting them down and running full throttle. Oh, I can still taste the last time you and me, and nothing but the tan lines keeps running through my mind.
All right. Beautiful.
Yeah.
Man, this has been a ton of fun. So if you had one piece of advice that you could give to anybody who's watching right now who wants to be at the level you're at, because you've obviously worked your ass off to get where you are, what would that one piece of advice be to people who want to aspire to be where you are in your career right now?
Well, somebody once told me, if you want to be a mixer, mix. And that means mix everything. Whether you're creating the material yourself or you're mixing people's demos, you're working for free. It's actually quite fun to mix. I feel like when I first heard of the job of mixer, there was, like Bob Clearmountain was the guy who led the way, and then you got the CLAs and the Tom Lord Alges and everybody to follow. It's just such a exclusive thing. You're the guy that someone's entrusting all of their hard work to bring it to the point that everyone will hear, and I think that's a really cool job. And the more you mix, the more you just dive in and start trying things, the better you'll get, the more consistent you'll become, and the more fun you'll have, the less time it'll take to do for you. So I'd say just mix everything available to you.
Well, there you go. Beautiful. Nick, it's been an absolute blast. Please stay right there. I'll be back with you in a second. Let me just close this out with our lovely fans. Ladies and gentlemen, This has been another amazing Waves Open session. It's been a true masterclass in mixing a modern country track with a song that we were pulling apart that's been at the top of the Billboard charts, and pretty much any of you who listen to country music have heard. So again, thank you for being here. Thank you very, very much to Nick. I'll be back next week with yet another Waves Open session, same time, same place. Please stay home, stay safe. Much love from me and Waves to you and your families. MPA out.
Baby, when I look at you with them baby blues cutting right through me, you set me on the rewind back to the good times when you couldn't get enough of me. I guess I'm giving myself away.